A veteran, after losing everything, chooses to live on the streets. However, due to a misunderstanding, he ends up being brutally assaulted and insulted by two young police officers. But then, something unexpected happens. Joseph had been a man who dedicated his entire life to his country, giving his body and soul to military duty, where he performed his role with unwavering courage and honor. From a young age, he had been shaped for war, a routine that had accustomed him to march through inhospitable terrain, endure extreme climates, and fight in battles that demanded more than just physical strength, but also mental endurance that few possessed. Over the years, he had faced enemies and witnessed scenes that no human eye should see. War had transformed him, leaving in his mind a collection of invisible scars, but deeply painful ones. He couldn't shake off the memories, which would return to him at the most unexpected moments, projecting images of lost comrades, sudden attacks, and screams that still echoed in his dreams. When he finally returned home, he didn't find the peace he had hoped for. His family, who had eagerly awaited him, soon distanced themselves, unable to understand the silences and intense reactions he couldn't control. Civilian life, with its routines and demands, felt strange and overwhelming. It was as if he were a stranger in a world he had once called his own. The weight of his experiences and the lack of understanding around him led Joseph to choose the streets as his new home, a place where he felt free from the constraints of a society that could never fully understand what he had endured. Amid the cold and solitude, he found a silent refuge, wandering with his only companion, a backpack containing his most intimate belongings, a symbol of the days when he was still recognized and respected, memories of a past that seemed increasingly distant. It was just another day for Joseph, who, lost in his thoughts, wandered the city streets with slow steps. The facades of buildings and stores had become familiar, for although he led a wandering life, Joseph always walked the same streets. As he passed by Mrs. Donner's market, an elderly woman with grey hair who, though cautious, never failed to give him a respectful nod, he nodded back. Further ahead, he crossed the entrance to a convenience store where Jason, a young employee, waved with a smile, which Joseph acknowledged with a slight hand gesture before continuing on his way. It was a ritual that repeated almost every day. People saw him pass by, and little by little, they became accustomed to his presence, understanding that he was not a threat, just a man with tired steps and a distant gaze. Reaching a narrow and somewhat dark alley, Joseph stopped. It was one of his favorite places to rest, where he could sit away from the gaze of others. He leaned against the brick wall, watching the street ahead, the cars passing by, the people in a hurry, and the sounds of the city that had become so familiar to him. A few minutes passed before a familiar face appeared. It was Justin, the owner of a modest but well-frequented restaurant across the street. Justin, with his stained apron and calloused hands, had always been a man with a good heart and occasionally brought Joseph a meal. "Good afternoon, Joseph," said Justin, approaching with a friendly expression. "Business is good today at the restaurant. I brought you a little something?" Joseph looked up and smiled faintly, though his face showed the weight of so many years lived. "Good afternoon, Justin. It's good to see you," he said, accepting the meal. "You're a good man. I don't know how to thank you." No need for that," Justin replied, shaking his head. "It's just some leftovers from lunch. It's nothing special, but I know you like the meat with potatoes." Joseph opened the container, and his face lit up when he saw the warm meal. "This is a feast, Justin. Thank you so much." Justin sat next to him, watching as Joseph began eating with a nearly ceremonial calm. "How's everything? The city's been a bit hectic lately, with all the activity," Justin remarked, trying to make conversation. "The city changes a lot, Justin, more than I can keep up with," Joseph replied between bites. "Sometimes I feel like it doesn't recognize me anymore, just like I've stopped recognizing so many things in it." Justin sighed. Yeah, we all change. But you know, Joseph, I remember you from the old days. They say you were a hero, that you fought for the country. Now I see you here, and it's hard to understand how a man like you ended up like this. Joseph paused, staring at the distant horizon, as if seeing beyond the city. Justin, war changes you. When I came back, well, I never really came back. A part of me stayed there, where fear and fighting were all I knew. Justin nodded silently, respecting the depth of what his friend was saying. The two were quiet for a moment, while Joseph finished a few more bites of the meal. "Save the rest for later, then," said Justin, when he saw Joseph close the container with half of the food still untouched. "I will. This dinner will be the best thing about my day," Joseph replied, carefully placing the container in his backpack. "Thanks again, Justin." Justin gave Joseph a friendly pat on the shoulder before standing up. "Take care, my friend. See you tomorrow, maybe." "See you, Justin," Joseph replied, watching him walk away to return to the restaurant. Once alone again, Joseph pulled a small, old and somewhat torn blanket from his backpack. With a sigh, he wrapped himself in it and murmured to himself, "Time to sleep a little, at least until the afternoon." Settled in the alley, he closed his eyes and drifted into a light, restless sleep, a sleep where the memories of the war still visited him. When the evening gave way to the darkness of night, Joseph woke up, feeling the characteristic cold beginning to envelop the streets. Still groggy, he stretched and slowly unwrapped the small blanket that had kept him warm during the afternoon. As he folded it carefully, as if he were guarding his few belongings, Joseph put it back into his backpack. Then, still seated and with his back to the street, he began rummaging through the items, searching for the meal he had saved for dinner. The alley where he was calm, and the noise from the street blended with the distant sounds of the city. He didn't notice that, just behind the street, a police car was passing slowly, lighting up the area with its discreet patrol lights. Inside the car, Scott watched attentively the solitary figure just a few meters away, fiddling with something inside a backpack. The low light and the man's furtive movements immediately caught his attention. "Hey, Dennis, look over there," Scott said, pointing discreetly at the alley. "That man, he seems suspicious, don't you think?" Dennis looked with interest and nodded. "Yeah, he's got his back to the street messing with something. Can't see what it is, but it could be anything." Scott frowned, not taking his eyes off the figure. "Think we should check it out? He might be hiding or something worse." "Better safe than sorry," Dennis replied, slowing the car down and looking for a place to park. The police car stopped in front of the alley and both got out, adjusting their belts and radios before walking towards the man. Joseph remained with his back turned, unaware of the approaching officers, focused on the task of opening the container to prepare for his meal. Scott and Dennis advanced toward Joseph with firm steps and attentive eyes, trying to figure out what he was doing in the back of the alley. When they were just a few meters away, Scott called out in a firm voice, "Sir, good evening. Please turn around for us." Joseph, still with his back to them and focused on organizing his backpack and the food he had saved for later, did not respond. Joseph's hearing, worn out from years of explosions and gunfire in battle, made it hard to notice the call when he was so focused. He didn't answer Scott. "You think he's ignoring us?" murmured Dennis, uneasy. "Maybe. He could have something suspicious there," replied Scott, taking a few more steps and raising his voice. "Sir, we're talking to you. Please turn around now." Joseph, still absorbed, began rummaging through his backpack again, unaware that the police were speaking to him. The movement seemed suspicious to Scott, who was starting to lose patience. "You know what? I'll handle this myself," Scott said irritably, and impulsively reached out, firmly touching Joseph's shoulder. Joseph reacted immediately, in an instinctive startle, as if he were still on the battlefield. The sudden touch on his shoulder triggered a reflex he couldn't control. He turned forcefully, his arm rising in a defensive move, while his other clenched hand, almost in a fist, lifted to push away what he momentarily identified as a threat. His eyes held a hint of panic, and his breath quickened. His body still remembered the defensive reflexes from the war, where any unexpected touch could mean life or death. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" shouted Scott, not expecting such a violent reaction. In a quick impulse, he retaliated, shoving Joseph with his shoulder and grabbing his arm forcefully, twisting it down in a harsh and aggressive movement. Joseph tried to resist, feeling the sharp pain run through his arm as Scott immobilized him. "Please, I just—" He began to stammer, his voice cut off by pain. But before he could finish the sentence, Dennis was already by his side, holding him by the other arm. "You're not getting out of this!" Dennis shouted, landing an elbow blow on Joseph's back, forcing him to bend even further, while Scott twisted his arms behind him. Joseph felt an intense stabbing pain spreading throughout his body, but in an attempt to break free from the hold, he gave a sharp movement with his shoulders, hoping to loosen himself. This gesture only irritated the officers more. "Oh, so you still want to fight?" Scott growled, tightening his grip on Joseph's arm, which felt like it was about to break. "Stay still! It's over for you!" In a swift motion, Scott shoved him against the brick wall, slamming him hard, while Dennis applied a lock on Joseph's other arm, practically immobilizing him completely. Joseph's breathing was heavy, panting, and his eyes showed a mix of fear and confusion, while he futilely tried to catch his breath. "Please, just listen to me," he tried to say, his voice hoarse from the pain and effort to speak between the blows. "You should have listened before reacting like a lunatic," Dennis snapped, pulling Joseph violently away from the wall and driving his knee into his lower back, forcing him to bend over. Joseph screamed in pain, trying to stay on his feet, but his legs faltered. "Please, I'm not resisting," he managed to murmur, his voice trembling as he tried in vain to explain. "Quiet!" Scott shouted, merciless. He shoved Joseph with more force, pressing him so that his head was against the wall. "You think you can attack us and then pretend to cooperate?" Dennis was already holding the handcuffs and, in a brutal motion, locked Joseph's wrists behind his back, pressing the metal tightly against his skin. "Done. Now you're under our control. If you try anything, you'll regret it." While Joseph struggled to breathe, his face pressed against the cold, rough wall, his thoughts were a mess. Memories of the war mixed with reality, the screams, the hits, and the pain, bringing back feelings he had tried to forget. "Get up and walk. No more nonsense," Scott ordered, pulling him harshly by the handcuffed arm. Joseph stumbled, still disoriented, but Dennis showed no patience and pushed him from behind, forcing him to walk. "Let's finish this, so he doesn't cause more trouble around here," murmured Dennis, while pushing Joseph toward the patrol car. "You think this is a joke, huh? Messing with your backpack in the dark, reacting like this? You're definitely up to something," Scott continued with disdain, looking Joseph up and down as they escorted him with hard, firm steps. Joseph tried once again to explain, his voice trembling, almost in despair. "Please, I was just getting my food. I didn't want to resist." Sure, Scott retorted, sarcastic, not believing a word. "You're wandering around, messing with your things as if you own the world, thinking we're going to fall for this story. Let's see if you tell the same story at the station." The three of them reached the patrol car, and Dennis opened the back door with a sharp motion. "Get in there. If you try any tricks, you'll see." Joseph shrank back, feeling his body still sore from the blows and the pressure on his arms, and entered the back seat with difficulty. He stayed silent, head down, while the doors closed around him, trapping him in the narrow space of the car. As Scott and Dennis took their seats in the front, Joseph listened to their exchange of comments, words full of suspicion and contempt. Did you see how he reacted? Looks like he had something to hide, said Scott, starting the engine. These guys on the streets always have something. I don't trust any of them, Dennis replied, glancing in the rearview mirror at Joseph, who remained silent, staring at the floor of the car. Well, we'll do a thorough check at the station. Maybe he's got something dangerous in his backpack, Scott added with certainty. Joseph felt his body shiver. The weight of what had just happened weighed on him, and all he could think about was how his life felt like an endless battlefield. The images of the streets, the sounds of the city, all seemed to fade as he was transported to the station, where his fate was now in the hands of those two men. The patrol car stopped in front of the station, and Scott got out first, opening the back door with a harsh pull. "Get out, let's go, move," he said, impatient. Joseph, still dazed, stumbled out, his body aching from the blows and his face marked by exhaustion and resignation. Dennis grabbed his arm, leading him into the building, while Scott followed right behind. As they entered the station, the atmosphere was cold, and a silence interrupted only by the sound of footsteps and the murmurs of other officers who cast curious looks at the new detainee. Scott and Dennis pushed Joseph into a small interrogation room and seated him in a hard metal chair, where he remained with his hands handcuffed, staring at the floor. "Now let's try to figure out this story," Scott said, crossing his arms and staring at Joseph with a stern expression. "Why did you react like that? What were you trying to hide in your backpack?" Joseph looked up, exhausted, and tried to speak calmly. I wasn't trying to hide anything. I just got scared, that's all. I thought I was alone." "Oh, don't give me that," Dennis retorted impatiently. "You were messing with your backpack in the dark, reacting like you were about to attack us. That doesn't look like the behavior of an innocent person." "Please," Joseph insisted, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't mean to attack anyone. I was just trying to eat, and I got scared when you touched me suddenly." At that moment, Daniel, a veteran officer with a calm demeanor and experienced eyes, passed by the door and stopped when he heard the argument. He looked at Scott and Dennis, then at the tired and disheveled man sitting in the chair. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm but less aggressive than the younger officers. "We found this guy in the alley, messing with a backpack in a suspicious manner," Scott explained. "We called out to him, he didn't respond, and when we tried to approach, he reacted like he was going to attack us." Daniel looked at Joseph for a moment and saw the look of helplessness on the man's face. "And did you check what he's got in his backpack?" Daniel asked. Dennis shook his head. "Not yet. We were trying to figure out why he acted that way." Daniel sighed, looking at Joseph's backpack with suspicion. "Let me see what he's got in there." He approached and carefully opened the backpack. Daniel's expression changed the moment he saw the medals and military decorations carefully stored at the bottom. "But what is this?" he murmured, pulling out one of the medals and examining the engraved symbol. "These are high-ranking decorations. Where did you get these?" Joseph raised his gaze, tired but with a renewed sense of dignity. "These medals, they're mine, each one of them." Scott and Dennis exchanged incredulous glances. "What do you mean they're yours?" Scott asked with a mocking laugh. "You don't exactly look like a veteran." "These medals represent my service to the country," Joseph continued, his voice calm but firm. "I've been in the military my whole life. I've been in many battles." Daniel looked at him with genuine interest. "Do you have any documents to prove that?" he asked, still examining the medals with respect. Joseph slowly shook his head. "No, I don't have anything but the medals. They're all I have to remember, and to show what I've lived through." The young officers exchanged doubtful glances with Daniel, as if questioning the credibility of the man before them. "No documents. We can't just take his word for it," Dennis said, trying to justify his stance. Daniel thought for a moment, then an idea came to him. "Maybe we can sort this out another way," he said, standing up. "I'll call the military and have someone from high command come verify your identity. If what you're saying is true, someone will recognize you." Joseph nodded, relieved. "Thank you, truly, thank you." Daniel left the room and went to his desk, where he dialed the military department. After a few minutes of waiting, he made contact with a superior. "This is Officer Daniel from Central Station. We need someone from high command to verify the identity of a potential war veteran we've detained here. He claims to have served, and we found high-ranking medals in his possession." On the other end, the military officer assured him that someone would be sent to verify the situation, and Daniel returned to the room where Joseph was waiting. "Someone will be here soon," Daniel said gently. "This should clear things up." Joseph thanked him with a slight nod, and then silence fell over the room. Hours passed, during which Scott and Dennis remained quiet, exchanging glances and observing Joseph, still with suspicion. Finally, the sound of firm footsteps was heard in the hallway. A tall man, with an imposing posture and impeccable uniform, entered the station. It was General George, a respected officer known for his long career and the respect he commanded wherever he went. As he entered, George scanned the room until his eyes landed on Joseph. Immediately he recognized him, and his expression grew serious. "Joseph," George said, in a low but clear tone. Joseph looked up, and upon seeing the general, a mix of surprise and relief appeared on his face. "General George," he murmured, almost not believing it. George walked slowly toward him, looking at the young officers who still couldn't comprehend the scene. "Do you know who this man is?" he asked Scott and Dennis, his tone serious enough to make them take a step back. "Well, he was acting suspicious and said the medals were his," Scott replied, confused. George looked at them sternly. "Those medals are legitimate. They represent a level of bravery and sacrifice that few achieve. This man served his country with exceptional courage." Daniel intervened, trying to understand better. "So you know him then?" "Yes, I know Joseph," George replied, his voice full of respect. "We've been on several missions together. He was a hero, a true soldier, someone who gave everything for this country." George turned back to Joseph, his expression one of understanding, fully aware of the story the veteran carried. He knew the reasons that had led Joseph to the streets, knew that Joseph had lost almost everything except the memories and war honors. Approaching, George looked at him and asked seriously, "Joseph, what happened here tonight? Why did these officers bring you in?" Joseph sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the situation and the general's attentive gaze on him. "General, I was just resting, trying to have dinner in peace. They approached suddenly, and I didn't hear what they said. When they touched me, I reacted like a reflex, like we used to do in the war, and they misunderstood everything." George frowned and turned to Scott and Dennis, his eyes full of authority and sharp seriousness. "Did you understand that he's a war veteran? Or didn't you notice the medals in his backpack?" Scott tried to justify himself, still visibly shaken by the general's presence. "General, he was in the dark, messing with something. Seemed suspicious. We called him and, well, he didn't respond." "Yeah, we thought he was hiding something," Dennis added in a low voice. George gave them a disapproving look, crossing his arms with a serious and firm expression. "Did you even think to check his backpack before bringing him in here arrested? You made him go through all this without even checking what he was carrying?" Scott and Dennis exchanged uncomfortable glances, their faces marked by guilt. Dennis tried to explain, his voice hesitant. "General, we thought he was resisting. He reacted violently when we touched him, and we thought he might be hiding something dangerous." George shook his head, disappointed. "You thought? Thought he was hiding something dangerous? And still you didn't even bother to check what was in his backpack? You knew this whole humiliation could have been avoided if you had simply done that?" The officers remained silent, realizing the mistake and lack of preparedness in their actions. Daniel, the veteran who had found the medals in Joseph's backpack, watched silently, visibly disappointed with the younger colleague's approach. George turned to Joseph, looking at him with empathy. "Joseph, tell me, how did they act when they approached you?" Joseph looked away, as if trying to suppress the memories of what he had just gone through, but he decided to speak. "They held me tightly, shoved me against the wall, hit me, and twisted my arms. I tried to explain, told them I didn't want trouble, but they didn't listen. They immobilized me forcefully, threw me against the wall, and handcuffed me." Joseph's description was simple, but each word carried the weight of the humiliation and pain he had felt. George shot a severe look at Scott and Dennis, whose discomfort only grew with every second. "You heard that?" George said, his voice full of reproach. "This man, who served his country and risked his life to protect all of us, was treated like a criminal by you. You humiliated him and acted with unnecessary violence. And all of this could have been avoided if you had simply looked at the medals he was carrying so carefully." The two officers lowered their heads, visibly embarrassed. Scott tried to mutter an explanation. We didn't know, General. It seemed like a suspicious situation. But now do you understand the magnitude of the mistake you made?" George interrupted, his voice firm. "You acted without thinking, without considering what you were doing. Every person deserves respect and consideration, especially someone who's carried more than you could ever imagine." After a long silence, Daniel approached George, and they exchanged a glance that seemed to seal the decision. "I've already contacted the supervision," Daniel said. "These two officers will be fined and temporarily suspended so they can reflect on what they did." George nodded, satisfied with the resolution. "It's the least we can do. A mistake like this requires consequences." The young officers nodded in silence, visibly remorseful. Finally, Scott turned to Joseph with an embarrassed look. "Sir, I'm deeply sorry for what happened. We were hasty and made a mistake. We didn't know who you were, and we sincerely apologize." Dennis, equally embarrassed, added, "I hope you can accept our apologies. What we did was unfair." Joseph nodded slowly, though still carrying a sad look. "I accept the apologies. But remember, not everything is what it seems. Everyone carries a story." George placed a hand on Joseph's shoulder, a gesture of respect and solidarity. "Go in peace, Joseph. Leave here knowing that, at least for us, your story is remembered and honored. If you ever need anything, we'll be here for you." Joseph gave a slight nod and left the station, walking into the cold night, with a dignity that no uniform or medal could take away. For him, each step back onto the streets meant a small triumph, knowing that, despite his situation, his past had finally been respected, at least by some. Joseph's story echoed through the station and served as a powerful reminder of empathy and respect. For Scott and Dennis, the lesson was clear. A person's value isn't in appearances, but in the story they carry. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.